I like to move it, you like to move it. Well, welcome class to our first lesson in this new topic, the movement of substances. Now, in this topic, we'll be looking at the different processes by which different types of substances move. Now, have you ever had this experience? You're inside a lift and suddenly you feel the great urge to let out some gas. There are people all around you, so you try your best. You tense up your bottom muscles and you try to keep it all in. But it's too bad. Some fart gas escapes your bottom, and pretty soon everyone's holding their nose and you're standing there looking very embarrassed indeed and smiling to yourself. We could have just avoided this embarrassment if fart gas didn't move. But as with all substances, we know that fart gas does move. You see, gases are made out of particles and they move. So like this perfume bottle here, if I just sprayed out some perfume gas, it will move and pretty soon you'll be all able to smell it. And the same goes with liquids and dissolved substances. If I drip some of this ink into this beaker of water, you know what happens. The ink spreads out until it's even throughout all the beaker. The ink particles move. Now, I saw this very interesting experiment as well, where someone basically lined up some Skittles, sweets, in a plate. And if you watch, you can see what happens after some time to the Skittles. Does something pretty amazing. Just watch. And enjoy the very zen music as you watch the ink food coloring from each of the Skittles move into the center of the plate to form a beautiful rainbow. Now, if at time you're bored, too much Skittles in your hands, you can try that yourself. So why are we so interested in the movement of substances anyway? Well, that's because it's very important to cells, which was our previous topic. You see, cells exchange substances with their environments. Substances move between cells and their environment. So if you look at this cell here and its environment here, there will be substances moving between these two locations. So useful substances like food and oxygen, they will move from the environment into the cell. And harmful substances, on the other hand, will move out of the cell into the environment, and this helps the cell to survive. So what kind of movement processes are there? Well, in this topic we'll be looking at three: diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. So in this lesson we'll just be looking at diffusion first. So we'll be asking the question, what is diffusion and what is its role in both plants and animals? In the textbook, these are in pages 32 to 35. Okay, but for this lesson, just refer to your notes and go accordingly. So what is diffusion? Well, it's quite a mouthful, but don't worry, I'm going to be helping you to understand it. But maybe you just want to pause the video for a while and write down this definition in your notes first. So diffusion is the net movement of particles from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. Now take a look at this diagram down here. You see that here someone has just farted in region A. So in region A, the concentration of fart particles is very high concentration. And in region B, the concentration of fart particles is very low concentration. That's why this guy is very happy. But he won't be happy for long, because particles tend to move a net movement from a region of high concentration to low concentration. So you guessed it, the fart particles will spread out, they will move from A to B, and this man is very sad indeed. Now there's an important point to make here, and that is, once all the particles are spread out evenly, do the particles stop moving? Well, the answer is no, they don't. The particles still move. particles are always moving. They're always moving randomly in random directions. But when they're all spread out evenly, there is no more net movement in a certain direction. So in this case, there's no more movement from A to B or from B to A. There's no movement in an overall direction, but particles are still moving randomly. So diffusion stops, but particles still move. Make sure you get that clear. So another way to understand this is by using a diagram like this. On the y-axis, we've got the concentration of particles, and on the x-axis, we've got region A and region B. And we know that the concentration at A is very high, and the concentration at B is very low. I'm going to introduce you a new word, a new phrase, to describe the difference in concentration between A and B, and that is the concentration gradient. You see, the concentration gradient is the difference between the concentration at 2 points. So if there is a difference, then there is a concentration gradient. And particles tend to move down a concentration gradient by diffusion. So here the particles will move down. It's like a slide. Whee! From high down to low. They will move down this concentration gradient by diffusion. So if we add this on to our definition, diffusion is the net movement of particles from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration, going down a concentration gradient, like a slide. A question for you, do you think this requires energy? Well, the answer is no, it doesn't. This is a passive process. Diffusion is passive. What causes the particles to move from A to B is the concentration gradient, the difference. So there's no additional energy needed from outside to cause the particles to move. That's what we mean by passive. So just a moment to say and emphasize again something I've already said. Look at this. When does diffusion stop? So it's easy to tell, right? Diffusion stops when the concentration of particles becomes equal throughout. They're equally spread out. But again, and I say this again, that the particles are still moving. So we actually have a phrase for this, a bit chim, but just for those who are interested, we call this a state of dynamic equilibrium. Equilibrium because they're equal throughout, but dynamic because the particles are still moving, but they're just spread out equally. We're just going to move on now to talk about what affects the rate of diffusion. And the first factor we're going to be talking about is temperature. So here's a very neat experiment. Here's a glass of ice water, very cold, a glass of tap water at room temperature, and some boiling hot water. And this guy is going to drip ink into each of these cups. So take a guess, in which cup will the ink diffuse the fastest? And watch the video, have a look at the results of the experiment. So, drippies, boop, drip, boop. Ooh, it's a race. And I think it must be quite obvious by now that the ink diffuses fastest in the boiling water. So what that tells us is, as temperature increases, the rate of diffusion also increases. So substances which are at a higher temperature will move faster. Now the second factor which affects the rate of diffusion is what we call the steepness of the concentration gradient. So take a look at these two situations. Over here, A has a very high concentration of a substance and B very low. And this difference is very big. So this is very steep. It's like a very steep slide. Well, here A has a very high concentration, but B is kind of medium, right? It's not that low, it's kind of there in the middle. So actually here the gradient is more shallow. It's not a big difference. So in which case do you think the substance will move faster by diffusion? Well, probably move faster in this case, because the steeper gradient allows a faster rate of diffusion. It's like a slide. The steeper slide, you move faster down. Woo! Here, the slide is not so steep, so you don't move that fast down. Alright, we're reaching the end of this lesson soon, and I just want you to think about this question for a while. So I've given you a situation where there's diffusion, but across a membrane. Okay, membranes, you heard about that, about cell membranes, right, which are partially permeable. So I've drawn a membrane like this. It's got some little holes to show that it's partially permeable. It lets some things through, but not other things. So have a look at this situation that on the left and on the right, there are different substances. Now, which ones do you think move by diffusion? So pause the video at this point and have a think through it. Alright, I hope you had a good time thinking about the question. So let's look at it more closely. Well, let's start with the orange particles. So if you look at these orange particles, there's a lot more on this side compared to this side. So the orange particles will move from high concentration to low concentration by diffusion this way. Right, easy. Now how about the red ones? So the red ones are higher on the right. So the higher concentration on the right will move from this region to the region of lower concentration on the left. How about our green substance? So this green particles, there's an equal concentration on both sides, so there will be no diffusion. Now, it's important to note here, do they not move at all? No, they do move. So actually, the green particles do move. Some of them move over here, but some of them also will move back. But overall, the concentration on both sides will remain equal, so there is no diffusion. Now finally, how about this blue substance here? Well, maybe you said that the blue substance would move over, right? There's a lot more on the right side, higher concentration on the right. It ought to move over to the left. But the problem is, it's too big to pass through the partially permeable membrane. So good job for you guys who thought of that. It's too big, it can't go through, and so it does not actually move by diffusion. So what moves by diffusion? It is the substances which are small enough to pass through the membrane and which have a concentration gradient across the membrane. There must be a difference in concentration, and the substance must be small enough. Alright, just to end off with two examples of partially permeable membranes you can find. So in the lab, we have this thing called visquing tubing. You always see in your MCQ questions. They are partially permeable. And of course, in our cells, we have the cell surface membrane itself, which is partially permeable. Finally, why is diffusion important in organisms? We're going to be looking at two examples, one in plants and one in animals, which you need to know. So in plants, our example comes from root hair cells. Now, root hair cells use diffusion to absorb mineral salts and to exchange gases. So just take a look here. Okay, outside the cell, we call it the soil solution. And inside the root hair cell, we have the cell sap of the root hair cell. Now, oxygen tends to be very high in concentration outside in the soil solution and a bit lower in the cell sap. So it's this concentration gradient that causes oxygen to move into the cell sap by diffusion. The same case is with the mineral salts, some are high in concentration in the soil, so they move by diffusion into the cell sap. Now the cell sap has a very high concentration of carbon dioxide, right? Because the cell is working, it's alive. So CO2, carbon dioxide, will move out of the cell sap into the soil solution by diffusion. So finally, our example of diffusion in animals is the exchange of gases in our lungs. And inside our lungs, you will find many structures, air sacs, called alveoli. Now here's a close-up of an alveoli, and you will see that the air that we breathe in flows into the alveoli, and the air that we breathe out flows out of the alveoli. Now the air inside that we breathe in is usually very high in oxygen and has very low concentration of carbon dioxide. So diffusion will happen, and carbon dioxide, which is much higher in concentration in the blood, will diffuse out of the bloodstream into the air spaces, and oxygen, which is high concentration in the alveoli, will diffuse from the alveoli into the bloodstream as such. So that is how our body gets oxygen and releases carbon dioxide into the environment. Alright, that's the end of our lesson. Thanks.